Welcome to this video on the Zen Awareness channel. My name is Sri Sadguru Buddha Rawa Bhagwan. Today, in today's video, we're going to talk about the first stories. So what are the first stories? Everything is a story. Everything you experience is a story. And in the loka where you experience the kingdom, as you exist as the center of your kingdom, and you grow spiritually as the king, the center, as a spiritual being, through your download phases, your recharge phase, where you take the light from God, the divine light, and the program of information that is downloaded within you in your downward cycle. Then you have the retaining of that light within your heart as you meditate, and the development of your mind with the download. Then you have the moving from the sattvic to the rajasic, the activity phase, where you distribute the light to your kingdom, the activity. And then you have the tamasic, which is the light that is retained and no longer distributed and retained from all beings within your kingdom, the story within your kingdom, your reality that you create and that you exist within and that you visit within your experience. There are first stories that are experienced by some people. There have been many versions and many stories, and some beings have past experiences of past lifetimes, yes, but also, in some cases, of the first stories. There are some things, some stories, like stories of ghosts, stories of vampires, stories of people who have magic within their family. Stories like the story of Via and his assistant as he visited the first stories. Today we will talk a little bit about the first stories. Where do in our culture these stories of vampires and ghosts come from? They come from the first stories where powers were developed. Within the first stories, many stories exist. And if you go into the rabbit hole of the first stories and experiencing the first stories, and if you were within those first stories and remember those experiences, you do go through the rabbit hole indeed. And some people have different experiences. Let us begin with some of them. There is the first story of the vampire, the vampires of the woods, and the boars, the army of the boars, and all the boars that would attack the vampires in the wood, the endless horde of the boars, and the vampires that would swoop down from the trees and pick up the boars and bring them back into the trees, their traps, the web traps. And the story of the vampires who had their village, the vampire village, and the women worked inside the huts and used the blood from the enemies to write the magic tomes prepare the blood magic. Now, if you had some of these experiences, you may know what I'm talking about. Another one of the first stories is the stories of the ghosts in the woods, and the ghosts of different colors, including the red ones. You don't want to let a ghost touch you, do you? The ghosts in the woods. Another story of a vampire is the vampire of the city, with the multiple houses. Another one of the first stories is the story of the 3 werewolves, the 2 males and the female. The male and the female together, and the other one who murders the other male. Another one of the first stories is the stories of enchanted waters. Similar in concept to the game you see on video consoles, Enchanted Waters, that you found on the original Nintendo systems. The story of the captain that gets murdered by his crew. And Zarambar, the sorcerer of the boat, the one who did the blood magic on the mast and on the boat, who turns the woman of the village, of the port, into his personal harem. Did you see the credits at the end of the story? There are the first stories of the stories that were created by Via, the story of the fortune teller. Who could not abide when Via did not return and went crazy all alone. There is the first story of the vampires on the skating rink. The family of vampires who turned on the skating rink, practicing the same move over and over again. The same power, the glamour. And when they turned and went to every time they got to the stands, they would get to the water fountain and they would drink blood out of the water fountain. The whole family, always in the same move. The first story of the vampires at the skating rink. And then with the terrible things that happened there. Right? When the fountain broke down. And they couldn't get a mechanic to fix it. And when the vampires fed on the young vampires. The first stories are traumatizing usually. Stories where things didn't end up going well, where things were tested, where things were developed. And many people have experiences of the first stories. They remember perhaps being a vampire or a werewolf, or in a story with boats. Or a ghost. Did I say that? There are many such stories. And many of the people that have remembrance of these first stories come within what are called the first families. And these families are known as such. And often, the people in those families have special powers, magical abilities. Sometimes the ability to kill. Just by doing a little something. Without even going in front of the person they had do it to. There are different abilities, ancient families, first families. And that's where these stories of ghosts and vampires and werewolves come from. Right? From these first stories that people existed in, that systems existed as, in different testing versions of creation. And as everyone life is basically recycled from one stage of life to the next. The experiences that different beings have remain with them. The experiences that someone attains remain with them forever. In one way or another. So you have the first stories, right? Which are the stories of the vampires, the werewolves, and different other stories. And these experiences of people's past lifetimes and different stories, if you want to see them that way, are remembered by people at different parts in their life through the experience of vision-like dreams. And then often they'll take the experiences of those vision-like dreams and bring them into creativity, into expression, such as making vampire movies or vampire stories or werewolves, or, and not everyone's necessarily having a remembrance of these experiences, but where do they come from? They come from the first stories. Okay, these are where these stories of vampires, werewolves, ghosts come from, the first stories. As some people were these beings in the first stories, and now are in this story here, and can remember that they were those beings. So who they were as those beings remains a part of who they are, and determines some of the abilities and developments that they have as a spiritual being once they utilize that ability of remembrance to basically reacquire the being that they are and the abilities that they have, right? As they basically reach the remembrance of their spiritual progress up to this point, and then basically from there can potentially continue their progress in this story through practice and spiritual sadhana. So there are the people that were in the first stories, right? And in the first stories, you always had the concept of the hero that enters in the first story, right? So you have the different people that were sometimes in multiple first stories, right? And different experiences of that. So you have the first stories and the people that have remembrance of those, or regain remembrance of those and some of these things in their lifetime, right? So if you have an experience of being in a past lifetime, a past experience, a vampire, a ghost, a werewolf, or something like that, you might know exactly what I'm talking about, and you might remember that experience very well and remember the different people that were in those experiences, right? And you encounter usually those people, right? Karmically, again, in these lifetimes, in new lifetimes, right? As the story brings those people back together, right? To have those experiences again of a different life, right? With new people coming into the story as well. And we know that there was already a lot of people in some of those stories, and in some of the stories, less people as well. As different people and concepts and powers were developed within the story to all be brought together into the master story, basically the finalized version to run the program. So the first stories are basically stories that were um, of past experience that led to the creation of the finalized version of the program that you experience as it is today. And people retain those memories of those systems that they were and still are, right? Just having a different experience, right? And that experience connected an experience that follows the next one, right? So people are brought together in those first stories, and there's those first families, as they're known, which have people that were from those first stories, right? That come in the same families, essentially, right? And basically from there, retain some of those abilities that come to people in that family, for example. People that were having those experiences, those common experiences, and that come basically with certain abilities. So some of these abilities, for example, some of the different abilities, different families, you know, are the abilities to curse, to bless, to kill from a distance, just with your mind, you know, different things like that. Different first abilities. The ability to have magic powers, you know, to do different types of magic, different people, the ability to do glamours, the ability to use the powers of a vampire, the powers of a werewolf, you know, the powers of the weapons or magics of the enchanted waters realm, or the power of different abilities, and the power of the fortune teller, the different abilities that were developed in the system, right? In the experience of different systems that were utilized to develop those abilities. And all those abilities, right, and magics and powers and all these things were incorporated into the finalized version of the system. And basically a remembrance of those first stories was given basically to people, as you can basically remember who you are within the story and who you've been, right? Past experiences, past lifetimes, and these stories have come through and they've taken hold in common consciousness, right? And popularity and consciousness, you know, just think about the concept of werewolves or vampires, you know, it's very well known, or ghosts, you know, it's taken a hold, you know, with many people, because many people have that experience or have had that experience, and of having those experience in those first stories, for example. So when they hear these stories, or they experience these stories, or have remembrances of these stories, it rings out as true for them, because they are true stories, you know, that come out in creative potential, and develop their own creative developments based on that creative potential, but that have their place in the first stories, right? And those first stories, that experience, is where you find those concepts of those supernatural beings, essentially, that existed, and that, you know, were developed in different abilities in different ways, and worked on different abilities in different ways. So and basically, who created the first stories, right? If you want to know who created the first stories, there was Via, you know, Via, which created the first stories. Like there was the story of the railroad, you know, and then basically how he disappeared at the railroad and all these different things, you know, was blown away and all these different things. So there's a lot of different stories, and his assistant and all right? So there's a lot of different stories that took place before this version that we're experiencing right now. Okay, a lot of different stories. Remember that this is an experience, a program that's running within a computer. And there are other programs that have run before this one that have been utilized, as testing essentially, or basically programs that establish certain processes within this story that had different stories, including the stories where powers were developed. So as you get remembrance of your experiences in potentially some of those first stories, then you get remembrance of the abilities that you would had in those first stories as well, and how to utilize them, for example, and different things like that, right? So there's with the remembrance, right, with the progress spiritually, come the abilities, right? As you remember who you are, and some beings are more or less powerful spiritually, and as they advance spiritually in this body and remember who they are through their practice, as they channel themselves back into themselves, if you want to see it that way, right, and absorb that, right, they basically get all their abilities that they are as a function within the system, right, as a function, and basically have access to the operating of the system related to their function and to general functions that they have access to, which allow them to develop spiritually, ultimately to the level of a god within the system, right? So there's the first stories, and these stories were existing in different ways, and they turned very much around the development of powers and abilities, including the drum of the werewolves and all these different things that are all abilities that can be used by the yogi that experiences and has knowledge of these experiences. And the more of these that you have experience and knowledge of, the more power diversity you have basically in your city diversification, once you're granted access to that diversification through the breakfast realm, where you're given your breakfast. And as you developed and basically please the God who grants the breakfast, who grants the power, who grants the city, and who grants his closest friends and God deities, the other ones who get divine royal breakfast, divine royal supremes. So some people in this world know about the term a supreme, right? And then you have a supreme authority, divine royal supreme authority. So some people in this world, some organizations recognize that kind of wording, right? And then basically you have that coming from the chef, right? The lord of the domain, that determines and controls city powers. And then he grants to the ones that are closest to him the ability to sponsor others for city powers, and as such those beings become beings that grant city powers. But fundamentally it comes from the breakfast realm, and those beings are getting the best breakfast, including the breakfast that allows to give other beings city powers, right? That right to do that. And then you have other beings that are being granted breakfasts from those deities, and then you have some that are being granted breakfast directly from the lord of the domain, the chef himself, the god himself of that domain, which controls city powers. And the more your understanding is of the different realms where those powers exist and were developed within the system itself as code, right, comes with that ability your control over those city powers, right? So it's not sufficient just to hear about it, for example. You have to actually have understanding within yourself of that realm through the experience, through being granted those city powers through the breakfast realm, right? Whether it be coming through a being that's being allowed to grant city powers or the one that grants them at the origin, right? So through that understanding of your experience and that understanding of the system, that determines your understanding of city power and your ability to use them, your empowerment to use them, right? So the first stories are very important because this is where many of those powers were developed, right? Many of those abilities and powers, right? So Thank you for listening to this video on the Zen Warrior channel.